Today's paranormal story comes from Megan, and it comes from the Smoky Mountains, so let's get into it. Last year for vacation, we decided to stay in a cabin in the Smoky Mountains. I have family in the area, and they had heard of an event that goes on called Synchronous of the Fireflies in Elkmont. I thought that would be so spectacular to see, so we all loaded up and headed into the mountains to see it. You have to hike into the woods because on these certain days at dusk or when it's dark, fireflies take off and fill the sky and woods, lighting everything up. While watching the fireflies, my son, who is 4 years old, comes over to me and says, "Mom, who is that man standing beside of us?" I looked around trying to see what he was talking about and said, "Bubba, there's no man standing beside us." He just stood beside me as still as could be and then asked me to pick him up and hold him, so I did. While I was holding him, he whispered in my ear, "Mom, who is that creepy guy with the red eyes?" I said, "Is this the guy you said was standing beside of us?" And he said yes. I turned a 360 and no one was around us. At this point, I'm uncomfortable too, and I told my kids and my family what he had said, and we all agreed that it was time to leave. While we were hiking out to the car, I'd still hold him and ask if the creepy man was gone, and he said no, he's following behind us. We ran, all the way back to our car. It's a year later now, and my son to this day will still ask who that creepy man was with the red eyes. I don't think he will ever forget about this, and I know I sure won't. Today's follower story comes from Fraser, and let's get right on into it because this one is spooky. This story takes place a few years ago at my aunt's house. We both live in a small town in Texas, and all of the houses in our neighborhood were built a long time ago and have interesting histories. Well, her house specifically was built in the 1940s, and one night I was at my aunt's house laying on her couch watching TV, and I got up to walk into the kitchen. The entrance to her kitchen is just a regular doorway but without a door, and anyways, I stopped walking and froze all of a sudden when I saw this tall figure of a man standing there. I left immediately after I saw him and did not go back for months, and when I finally did gain the courage to go back to her house months later, I had another experience. I was laying on her couch watching TV again when I heard footsteps walk up behind the couch, so as any normal person would do, I looked up but saw nothing. Then, all of a sudden, her Alexa made this loud noise as if something activated it, but nothing on the TV said anything relatively close to Alexa. After that, I'm laying on the couch, and I could hear demonic laughing in my right ear. My aunt has lived alone in this house since 2008 when she bought it and has always experienced weird things in this house. She too has heard footsteps and demonic laughing. She would come home from work and a door would be open that was shut or vice versa, and she would come home to her Alexa playing weird 40s music when no one had been in her house that day. Also, the previous owner had left a stereo system which she had never touched or used, and she came home multiple times to it just blasting this static FM radio sound. She had started to think that the ghost may be following her from her other homes also, as she's experienced paranormal things at all the places she's lived in, just not as bad as this house. Even in her car, we believe the ghost has followed her. In her old car, the radio would randomly change stations without us touching it. We just blew it off as it being a problem with the radio, but then, after she got into a wreck and started driving my grandmother's car, and it also happened in there, we started to question things. And then again, once she was finally able to get her a new car a month after owning it, it started doing the exact same thing those other cars did. Now, the radio is to be a coincidence, but it seems like a big one if so. Over the years she's lived in her house, the thing in her house would leave and come back, as it seems. It would be very active and then all of a sudden be gone for a year or more. Today's story comes from a follower who wants to share with us a very eerie dream she had at the age of 14, so let's get into it. So the dream started with me, quote-unquote, waking up from a nightmare at my grandma's house at around 2:30 to 3 a.m. I was terrified overall and hyperventilating. My mom came in and sat on the edge of my bed trying to comfort me, saying, "It's alright, baby, did you have a nightmare?" And I remember me just trying to get my head straight when I finally stared back at her. And in a very stern yet calm tone, I said, "You're not my mom." And whatever had lurked from the shadows to comfort me was suddenly launching at me and choking the life out of me. My heart was racing and I was trying so hard to get out of the bed and into the living room where I could see the light was on from underneath my door. It felt like a good 10 to 15 minutes until I was able to finally open my door and my grandma was laying on the couch as usual, plus an episode of Law & Order was on that she had watched about 5 to 10 times at this point. I just remember passing out from exhaustion right then and woke up. I was scared once more and got up to get a glass of water and calm down a bit. Weird thing is that when I opened the door, my grandma was laying on the exact position as in my dream and the same episode of Law & Order she had watched a few times before was playing. Only about 2 minutes after the exact scene. Fun fact though, my mother did not live in my grandmother's house and whatever was trying to act like her would not show me her face. It just had her voice. Her face was a blur. Today's story is going to come from Taylor, and let's jump right on into it. When I was around 12 to 13 years old, me and my mom moved into my grandparents' house after my mom and dad split. Months go by of living here, and very strange things started happening to us. Like, when I was alone, I would hear noises coming from my kitchen, and when I walked in, all the kitchen cabinets would be open. I decided to tell my grandma what I had seen, and she explained that a long time ago my family played the Ouija board and they didn't know they had to say goodbye when they were done. Ever since then, their house has been very haunted. 5 months go by, and things started to get increasingly worse for me. I would have nightmares every night that were so dark my mom thought about taking me to a doctor. We would see black shadow figures running from room to room, and we would see black shadows of animals like bears, dogs, and birds. It got so bad to the point that we thought about moving. So the scariest part of what happened was one night when I was sitting up in bed with the lights off, I saw this huge black figure standing in the corner of my room, watching me. The feelings I got from this creature were anything but human. I said a prayer to try and get it to go away, and it ran towards me and disappeared. The next morning, I woke up with 3 scratches down my arm. After that, we decided to get a medium to come out and bless the house and find out what was going on. He said there were portals created from the Ouija board and that they could never be permanently closed, it would always come back. The most fascinating thing about this whole experience is that we found out the land we lived on had been native land, and that's why we were seeing shadows of animals. But then the medium looked at me and said that there was an attachment to me. He helped me to get rid of the attachment, and that was it. Nothing else happened to me like that again. The hauntings still go on to this day with the Native Americans, but we just have to sage and bless the house and they leave, but they always come back. And today's follower also lives in Southwest Virginia just like I do, so we have an Appalachian story on our hands. Without further ado, let's get into it. One night when I was about 13, my mom, brother, sister, and me were riding out to town for some ice cream. I was in the back seat, sitting up in the middle talking to my mom and siblings who were in the front. Out of nowhere, a big, bright, almost like it was lit up orange orb about the size of a basketball floated quickly in front of my mom's vehicle. We were all so shocked and we got quiet. I said, "What was that?" And we never figured it out, but I've heard several stories of these balls of light over the years. We also have property by where we hunt, fish, camp, etc. And about a month ago, or maybe 2, we were riding our 4-wheelers at night. I was on a new trail that my husband had recently discovered, and I was looking at the trees as we were riding by, and all of a sudden, I see a tall, white, floating, transparent figure following me. Its face was shaped like the dog from The Nightmare Before Christmas, and it quickly darted behind a tree and disappeared. We've heard a lot of things while camping out there, never audible voices, but we always hear loud knocks on trees at night. They almost sound like a pattern, not like a bird or animal, but as if a human is doing it, but we know it isn't human because we're out in the middle of nowhere. And last but not least, I live in the house that I grew up in. There's always been lots of paranormal activity here. As a kid, our lights would turn on and off, our faucets would turn on, shadow people all over the places, and voices saying hey and loud sighs. My husband and I were dating and he spent the night. We were on the couch in the dark about to go to sleep when we heard what sounded like one of the kids get up and go to the bathroom, and we heard the toys in the bathtub hitting the bathtub. We got up to look and nobody was in there. The kids were sound asleep. When I grew up here, my parents were asleep one night and my mom woke up to a figure in her bedroom doorway that looked like my sister. My sister was about 5 at the time, and she spoke to her and said, "Come get in bed with Mom, honey." And it started walking towards her. As it got closer, its face started to change, and she said it looked like what people on TV say an alien looks like. It had huge eyes and a ridge running down the center of its face. It stood there and stared at her, and then she remembered nothing else after that. The next morning when she woke up, our front door was wide open. For years, I heard a man call out my name, wake me up from my sleep. It sounded like my dad, but it wasn't my dad, and I knew it wasn't because it happened for years after they built their house and then I moved back into my home. It happened from time to time as a child up until I was an adult. It wasn't a loud whisper. It would get a little louder each time until I would wake up. My daughters have seen children, heard voices, and experienced shadow people as well. Many mornings they would wake and say, "Mommy, why did you come in and cut off the TV and stare at us last night?" But it wasn't me. But I never let them know because I know it would terrify them. Today's story comes from Amelia, and let's get right on into it. Hi, my name is Amelia, and I am almost 17 years old. My life is kind of weird and creepy. I've been a medium my whole life and have a lot of stories, but I'll share the creepiest one. I lived in Missouri most of my life, and my home was already old, so this is no surprise. One night I was in bed, and my bed had no bottom, like you can go under it if that makes sense, but it was really heavy, like you can't move it without taking it apart, and that's not even with the mattress on it. When I was on my iPad not wanting to go to bed, my bed just started shaking. I didn't think much of it and went to bed. We have a lot of random earthquakes in Missouri. The next night, I wanted to record myself sleeping so I could catch another earthquake and if it happened. But it was just the bed and me. Nothing was moving. I showed my parents and thought it was them, so I got on the bed and had them move the bed back and forth, but nothing worked, so we left it. Since then, it's happened like 4 times in Missouri, but when I was 14, we moved to Oregon, and apparently the ghosts didn't like that. I kept on getting pushed around in bed and pulled down, almost falling off, and I had a loft bed. I kept on getting bruises and cuts all over me. We moved after the big wildfires a couple of summers ago and now live in North Carolina, and I'm way more careful with spirits. I sometimes get hurt, but I have protection stuff up. This follower would like to remain anonymous, and this story is just simply titled Paranormal Experience. When I was 14, I had woken up suddenly. It was around 1 in the morning. I do remember checking my phone to check the time, but I really had to pee. And I usually wait until morning to go to the bathroom, but that night I couldn't. Something felt very off as soon as I woke up, and my energy was off. The room felt very cold. I had goosebumps, and I was wearing a long-sleeve shirt and sweatpants. But I got out of bed and had just swung my feet over the side. Immediately, something was telling me to get back in bed and fall asleep. I didn't listen. Whatever I was feeling in my bladder was worse, I guess. I got up, and this feeling was the only thing I could think of. And then I finally heard it from the hallway, like a scratching sound, and it was heading right down the hallway. I was finally able to realize that I should have stuck with my instincts, and I immediately put myself back into bed and waited. The scratching came to a stop outside my door. It had scratched at my door for a good 5 minutes, and then finally a really loud thump. And that was the end. It would make some more scratching sounds back down the hallway. I heard it for about 10 more minutes, and then I didn't hear it again, but no doors or anything were ever opened, and our windows were closed because it was the middle of winter. It's like it disappeared all of a sudden, but the next morning when I asked my family if they had heard anything, they said no and looked at me funny when I tried to describe it, but that's the only time anything like this ever happened. Today's story is going to come from Jane. Hi, just call me Jane. I live in southeastern Kentucky. The house that we used to live in, well, more specifically the surrounding land, always made me feel uneasy, day or night. I never saw anything, but I always felt like I was being watched when I would go outside. Neighbors were few and far between, and we would always hear stuff outside at night, which we chalked up to stray dogs, but we never actually saw any dogs around the house, except for ours, but she was an inside dog. One night, I had to go pick my husband up from work. It was 9:30 at night in November, so pitch black aside from our crappy porch light. As soon as I stepped off the porch, I immediately felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and noticed that it was dead quiet. No leaves rustling, no sound from the creek nearby, nothing. I put my daughter in the van and then walked around to get her brother in. I planned to go around to the other side and buckle her in. While I was buckling my son in, that feeling of being watched just got more intense, and right as I clicked the last buckle, my son looked past my shoulder and whispered like he's not wanting to be heard. "Mama, what's that?" I flew into the van and locked all the doors. I buckled my daughter in as quickly as I could and then climbed to the front seat. I immediately looked over to the far part of our yard and it's pitch black. I couldn't see anything. I turned on the van fully expecting to see something standing in the headlights when it came on, but nothing was there. I backed out and drove away as fast as I could. This may not be super scary since I didn't actually see anything, but my son was dead serious and whispered like he was frightened. That, coupled with the overwhelming feeling of being watched while my back was to the far part of the yard, by far the scariest experience of my life. So today's story is titled The Hat Man That Watches Me When I Sleep, and it comes from Brittany. I don't talk about this much because I'm afraid if I do it'll give him power, but I've been dreaming about this tall man in a hat for 22 years now. On the nights that he visits me, he hovers over my bed, staring at me even though I can't see his eyes. It's just a dark shadow of a face with a broad stature and a dark trench coat. Sometimes when he visits me, he will be in the corner of the room or lingering just outside my door frame. Recently, I've been experiencing sleep paralysis where I wake up but my body can't move. Every time this happens, I can see or feel the Hat Man moving closer to me and sometimes choking me. It takes everything in me to move my body, and when I do, I fully wake up feeling his presence still lingering. I think the scariest part about him is that he doesn't feel like a spirit, but more like a dark entity trying to terrorize me. He's been getting more and more aggressive lately with the way he visits me at night. I start to see him in the reflection of my TV or even hear a strange ringing in my ear, which tells me he's close by, watching me. I know I don't live in a haunted house because this dark mass has followed me to 5 different places. The only one who believes me is my partner, since he has seen me during a sleep paralysis attack. He says even though he never sees the Hat Man, he can also feel something in the room with us. I hope I'm not the only one going through this. Happy dreams, Brittany. When I was a little kid, probably 7 or 8, a corner of my bedroom always had a spirit in it. It was the same spirit all the time and felt like a male presence. However, every time I made my grandmother angry, it would get worse and be this huge horrifying thing until I couldn't sleep and I barely could breathe. I now suspect her of being a witch, or at least able to control spirits. When I was 17, I went to community college and my best friend was 19, and I stayed with her a lot if I had to be at school super early the next day, because she lived like 5 minutes from it. My boyfriend at the time smoked, and so did I, so she decided she wanted to try. This was when you just had to be 18 to buy cigarettes. She bought a pack of what my boyfriend and I smoked, and at her house that night after her parents and younger brother had gone to bed, we snuck out behind her parents' shed to smoke. We were both raised super religious, so we had to hide it. I noticed a weird shadow on the shed that looked like a person, but I chalked it up to be a tree, or my imagination, or something. I was on my second cigarette when my phone went off. It was my grandma, telling me she knew what I was doing. I look up at the shadow on the shed. It looks at me, then vanishes. Another grandma story. 2 years ago, when my husband and I were dating, we took a road trip to see his brother and sister-in-law. My husband was also raised religious, but was a good kid, so he was 23 and had never drank. My brother-in-law, no longer religious, so after dinner one night he said we should all have a drink and do karaoke. And as soon as my drink is poured, my grandma texts me, "I'm worried about you. I feel like if you do whatever it is you're about to do, it'll ruin your life forever. Don't drink while you're there. You'll be an alcoholic." I ignored her and drank and had fun that night. It's been 2 years and a week ago I threw away 1/4 of a tequila bottle we've had in the freezer since we came back from that trip. I occasionally drink a margarita when we go eat Mexican, so joke's on her. I was staying with my cousin a few years ago and we were up late and got hungry, so we went to the kitchen to find food and both immediately realized we were not alone. We both turn towards the living room and we see a dark figure standing by the TV, and it knows we see it. So we get our snacks and we calmly walk through the trailer past the shadow person and into her bedroom. As soon as we shut the door, we hear it walk slowly over to the bedroom and stand outside. She has her bedroom warded so it couldn't come in, but it stood there for an hour. It was this awful, dark, heavy feeling. Finally, after an hour of trying to get in the bedroom, it turned and went back to the living room and was gone when we got up. Today's stories are going to come from Lewis. I live in the home counties just north of London, which is full of small towns and villages connected by some winding country roads, some of them so slim that you can only fit one car on the road at a time. I was driving home with my best friend from the cinema. I was 18 at the time, 27 now, one night, and the fastest route home was through the woods. There is an area where a bridge goes across the river, and quite often this causes a thick fog. I put my dip beams on and carried on as another car drove toward us. This lit up the fog so it was an opaque white. All of a sudden, a black shadow figure walks across the road directly in front of us, so I slammed my foot on the brakes as we just glided through this figure. Me and my friend were both in total shock and got out of the car to check out what was behind us and if something was there. But there was nothing. There's also no pedestrian walkway on this bridge, so the shadow would have just been walking directly on the road. The weirdest part was that it stopped and turned to look toward us as we drove through it. Never went home that way again after that. When I was at university, I lived in shared hall accommodations for the first 2 years. In our first year, there were loads of strange goings-on that occurred within our hall. It was basically a long hallway with 10 bedrooms shooting off of it, and a kitchen in the room at the very end. Countless nights we would hear running up and down the hallway in the early hours that sounded like a child running. It wasn't a heavy figure. The hallway lights were on a sensor, and we would try to catch whatever it was. We thought it was someone possibly playing a prank on us. The sensor had never been tripped, so no movement in the hallway had ever been picked up. As the year continued, various other incidents happened. For instance, I walked past my housemate's bedroom and the door was propped open and saw her standing next to her bed in the corner of my eye. I turned around to ask if she wanted to come out and smoke with me, and the room was empty. Figuring she had gone in the other en-suite bathroom, I called her name, and she came out of the kitchen at the other end of the hallway to answer. Freaked out, I explained to her that I had just seen her or something stood next to her bed, and we both combed her room and bathroom top to bottom to see if there was anyone there. But there was no one. While with this same friend one evening, we were sat in my bedroom chatting and watching TV around 2 a.m., and all of a sudden the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. We both looked straight at the bedroom door on the other side of the room. Both of us were completely silent as the room dropped temperatures and became chillingly cold. The coat on the hook on the back of my door moved slightly, with one of the arms moving up at about 5 centimeters, and then back down again. After around 30 seconds, we both looked at each other at the same time and went, "Did you feel that?" There was definitely something that came in the bedroom that night, and it had the most menacing and evil presence I had ever felt. Not long after these, I began to have nightmares and sleep paralysis, always with a lady in a white dress. She looked almost Victorian. She would slowly walk across the room and pick me up and throw me towards the bedroom door. It would always be in slow motion. It was usually worse if there was an electrical hum from the aux cord on my speaker due to it touching something or if there was a TV static. I believe this entity was attached to my friend as the activity stopped when I moved away from her.